I never lied, Your Honor. I chose silence to honor a soldier who gave everything.
Today, a woman walked into Judge Judy's courtroom accused of lying for money. Not exaggerating. Not misunderstanding the facts. Flat out lying, according to the person standing confidently across from her. But what no one in that room expected was that, by the end of this case, an entire courtroom would be in tears, and America would be confronted with a truth that had been buried for decades. The woman at the center of the accusation was an elderly widow. She moved slowly to her seat, hands trembling as she folded them together in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor as if she didn't quite belong in a room that loud, bright, and unforgiving. She wasn't dressed to impress. No sharp suit. No polished confidence. Just a quiet woman carrying a story that, according to the accusation, didn't add up. Across from her stood the accuser, calm, composed, clinical. Every word precise. Every detail presented as proof that this widow had fabricated her hardship for financial gain. To them, this wasn't personal. It was procedural. A case of numbers, paperwork, and inconsistencies. And in a courtroom built on facts, that confidence carried weight. Judge Judy listened without interruption. Her expression was unreadable. No nods of sympathy. No raised eyebrow of disbelief. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you wonder whether the truth has already been decided. What the accusation claimed was simple, that this woman had exaggerated her circumstances, twisted her story, and used her late husband's name to gain money she didn't deserve. But what wasn't being said, what no one in that room understood yet, was that the very thing she was accused of lying about was tied to a sacrifice far deeper than money. A sacrifice rooted in service, in silence, and in a promise made long before this courtroom ever existed. The widow sat alone. Not just physically but emotionally. No witnesses beside her. No loud defense. Just a quiet resolve that looked dangerously close to defeat. And as the accuser spoke with growing certainty, it began to feel like this would be just another case where paperwork outweighed pain. But this wasn't just a case about facts. It was about dignity. About what gets left out of official records. And about a truth that had been protected, not for profit but for honor. If you believe that veterans and their families deserve respect, stay with this story. Because what was about to unfold in this courtroom wouldn't just decide a case. It would expose a sacrifice that no document could ever fully capture, and deliver one of the most emotional verdicts Judge Judy has ever given. The accusation was delivered with confidence. Not anger. Not emotion. Just certainty. The accuser laid out their argument as if it were already proven, pointing to what they called a pattern. Dates that didn't align, statements that shifted slightly, documents that should have existed but didn't. According to them, the widow's story wasn't just flawed. It was manufactured. A carefully shaped narrative designed to extract compensation by appealing to sympathy rather than facts. They spoke about missing paperwork as if it were irrefutable proof. Hospital records that stopped abruptly. Benefit applications that were delayed. Gaps that, on paper, made no sense. To the accuser, these weren't oversights or accidents. They were evidence. Evidence that the hardship had been exaggerated, that the story had been altered over time, and that the truth had been bent just enough to serve a financial purpose. As the accusations continued, the widow sat frozen. Her hands trembled in her lap, fingers pressing tightly together as though she were holding herself in place. When she tried to respond, her voice faltered. Words came out slowly, unevenly, sometimes stopping altogether as if her memory itself were being interrogated. She didn't interrupt. She didn't object. She simply listened as her life was reduced to a list of inconsistencies. When it was her turn to speak, she tried to explain. She talked about dates the best she could, about years that blurred together, about paperwork she didn't know how to access or didn't understand at the time. But every explanation seemed to lead to another question, another doubt. The harder she tried to clarify, the more uncertain she sounded. Not because she was lying, but because she was reliving moments she had spent years trying to survive. From the outside it didn't look good. In a courtroom built on timelines and documents, hesitation reads like deception. Pauses sound like evasion. And emotion, no matter how real, often feels irrelevant when stacked against forms and signatures. Judge Judy listened closely. Her questions were sharp and precise, cutting straight to the point. She asked about specific dates, specific applications, specific decisions that had been made, or not made years earlier. There was no visible sympathy yet. No softening of tone. Just a focus on facts, as if she were testing the structure of the story to see where it might collapse. Each question landed heavily. The widow struggled to keep up. She answered honestly but not cleanly. Her voice broke more than once. At times she stopped mid-sentence, swallowed hard, and tried again. It wasn't the kind of testimony that reassures a room. It was the kind that makes people uncomfortable. The accuser seized on that discomfort. They highlighted every pause, every correction, every moment of uncertainty. To them this was confirmation. A story that couldn't stand on its own without emotion wasn't a solid story at all. And as they spoke, it became clear they believed the case was already won. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. What had begun as sympathy slowly gave way to doubt. The widow's grief, once quietly respected, now felt scrutinized. Her pain was no longer invisible, it was suspicious. And the longer the questions continued, the more it seemed like the system itself was closing in around her. Judge Judy remained unreadable. She didn't interrupt the accuser's momentum. She didn't step in to soften the blows. She simply listened, occasionally redirecting with another pointed question. To anyone watching, it felt like she was weighing something carefully, but what that was no one could yet tell. And that uncertainty was unsettling. Because if even Judge Judy, known for cutting through lies without hesitation, wasn't rushing to defend this woman, then maybe the accusation had merit. Maybe this really was a case of sympathy gone too far. Maybe the widow's story was collapsing under its own weight. The widow sensed it too. Her shoulders slumped slightly as the questions piled up. Her answers grew quieter. She wasn't just defending a claim anymore, she was defending her integrity. And with every passing moment, it felt like that integrity was slipping through cracks she didn't know how to seal. This was no longer just about money. It was about whether her life, her struggle, and her memories were going to be believed, or dismissed as convenient fiction. And as the accuser concluded their argument, the question hanging over the courtroom felt heavier than any verdict yet to come. Was this woman lying? Or was she being crushed by a system that couldn't recognize pain unless it came neatly documented? At that moment, no one in the room had the answer. Not the accuser. Not the audience. And not even Judge Judy, at least not yet. For the first time since the case began, Judge Judy leaned back slightly in her chair. It wasn't a dramatic movement. Most people in the room probably didn't even notice it. But the tone changed. The rhythm of the questioning slowed, and the courtroom felt different. Less like a trial moving toward a conclusion, and more like an investigation that had just taken an unexpected turn. Judge Judy began revisiting the paperwork, but this time she wasn't looking for what was missing in general. She focused on when things were missing. Specific years stood out. Not random gaps. Not careless omissions. Entire stretches of time where records simply stopped, then quietly resumed later. Years that, on paper, were supposed to be the most important. She asked about one of those years directly. The widow answered softly, explaining that she didn't remember every date clearly. Judge Judy pressed a little further, narrowing the question, anchoring it to a moment that should have been easy to recall. The widow hesitated. Not the brief hesitation of someone thinking, but the kind that feels like a door being held shut. Judge Judy didn't accuse her. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked another question. Then another. Each one precise, each one aimed at the same narrow window of time. And slowly a pattern began to emerge, not of deception but of avoidance. What struck Judge Judy wasn't that the dates didn't line up legally. On paper the discrepancies could be explained away. But emotionally they didn't fit. People forget things for many reasons, but they don't forget entire years unless something in those years is too heavy to revisit. The widow's voice changed whenever those dates came up. Her posture stiffened. Her eyes stopped moving as if she were bracing herself against something only she could see. Then Judge Judy asked one final question. A simple one. Direct. It should have been easy to answer. The widow froze. Not hesitated. Not stumbled. She stopped completely. Her hands, which had been shaking throughout the hearing, went still. Her eyes fixed on the desk in front of her. Seconds passed. The courtroom waited. Even the accuser didn't speak. There was no interruption, no objection, no movement at all. Judge Judy waited too. Finally the widow looked up, not at the accuser but at the judge. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Your Honor. I didn't lie, she said. She paused, swallowed hard, and continued. I just couldn't say everything. The courtroom went silent. It wasn't the dramatic kind of silence that follows an outburst. It was deeper than that. The kind that feels heavy, like everyone in the room has just realized they've been standing on the wrong side of something important. Judge Judy didn't respond immediately. She didn't ask a follow-up question. She didn't challenge the statement. She simply looked at the widow, really looked at her, for the first time since the case began. Not as a claimant, not as a defendant, but as a person carrying something unresolved. The accuser shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't part of the plan. The argument had been built on inconsistencies, on pressure, on forcing a collapse. But this wasn't a collapse. It was a confession of a different kind, one that didn't sound like guilt but like restraint. Judge Judy broke the silence carefully. She asked why. Not, why did you lie, but, why couldn't you say everything? It was a subtle difference, but it mattered. The widow tried to answer. Words failed her again. She shook her head slightly as if the explanation existed but refused to come out. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just sat there, holding on to whatever truth she had been guarding, even as the weight of the accusation pressed down on her. At that moment, it became clear that this case was no longer about missing documents or delayed applications. Something else was at work. Something intentional. Something protected. Judge Judy sensed it. The room sensed it. The story everyone thought they understood suddenly felt incomplete. And the question was no longer whether the widow had lied, but why she would choose silence over vindication. What truth was she protecting? And more importantly, who was she protecting it for? That question lingered in the air, unanswered, as Judge Judy prepared to take the case in a direction no one had expected. The widow took a breath that sounded heavier than it should have. It wasn't just air she was pulling in, it was resolve. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she began, slowly, as if each word had to be lifted from somewhere deep inside her. My husband was a U.S. Army veteran, she said. The room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No one gasped. But something changed instantly. The accusation, the paperwork, the tone of skepticism, none of it vanished, but it moved to the background. Because this wasn't a detail added to strengthen a claim. This was the foundation of a life. She explained that when he came home from service, he wasn't the same man who had left. He tried to be. He smiled when people were around. He shook hands. He said he was fine. But at home, behind closed doors, the war followed him. Nightmares. Long silences. Sudden anger followed by deep shame. There were days when he couldn't leave the house and nights when he wouldn't sleep at all. She didn't use clinical terms at first. She didn't say PTSD right away. She just described what it was like to live with someone who was fighting a war long after the uniform was put away. Over time the illness came too. His body weakened. His mind tired. And the man who had once stood tall in uniform began to feel like a burden in his own home. That was when he made her promise. Her voice trembled as she repeated his words, the ones she had carried silently for years. He told me, if I ever fall apart, don't let the world see me that way. I was a soldier. Let me stay one. The sentence landed hard. It wasn't just a request. It was a plea for dignity. A man who had served his country asking that his worst moments never define him publicly. A husband asking his wife to protect his identity, even if it cost her comfort, clarity, or help. She explained that after that, everything changed. When doctors suggested long-term treatment, he refused. When paperwork came in, he pushed it aside. He didn't want to be documented. He didn't want to be reduced to symptoms. And she respected that, because loving him meant honoring what mattered to him most. That was why the documents were missing. Not because they didn't exist, but because they were never completed. She avoided hospitals unless there was no other choice. She delayed benefits applications again and again. Not because she didn't need help, but because accepting help meant putting his decline into official language. It meant writing down the things he had begged her to keep private. It meant turning his pain into a record. So she chose silence. She chose dignity over assistance. She chose to carry the weight herself. As the years passed, that silence became habit. Bills piled up. Questions went unanswered. Forms were half-filled, then tucked away. And when her husband eventually passed, she didn't suddenly become stronger. She became more careful. Every decision she made afterward was shaped by the promise she had made to him. She wasn't hiding the truth to gain anything. She was hiding it to keep something sacred intact. The courtroom felt different now. The air was thick, not with tension, but with recognition. People weren't looking at her as a claimant anymore. They were seeing her as a guardian, someone who had protected a soldier's dignity long after the battlefield was gone. Even Judge Judy sat quietly, listening without interruption. No sharp questions. No corrections. Just attention. The widow's voice softened as she finished. She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't ask to be understood. She simply told the truth she had been avoiding, not because it was false but because it was painful. By the time she stopped speaking, the room was silent again. But this silence was different from before. It wasn't judgmental. It wasn't skeptical. It was emotional. Somewhere in the audience, someone wiped their eyes. The accuser didn't speak. And for the first time since the case began, it was clear that this story was never about inconsistencies at all. It was about a life lived quietly, a promise kept faithfully, and a sacrifice that had gone unseen, until now. The truth was no longer hidden. And the weight of it was beginning to break the room. For a moment after the widow finished speaking, no one moved. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if everyone understood that something important had just been placed on the record, something that couldn't be taken back. Then Judge Judy leaned forward, resting her hands on the bench. Her voice when she spoke was calm, steady, controlled. "Before we go any further," she said, "there's something we need to clear up." She explained that she had already reviewed the military records connected to this case. Not casually. Thoroughly. Service history, dates of deployment, length of duty, and the documentation that confirmed the husband's time in uniform. Every detail had been checked before the hearing ever began. The widow looked up, surprised. Judge Judy continued, laying out what she had found. The service history wasn't in question. It was verified. The records were real. The timeline of his service aligned exactly with the years that had caused so much confusion in the courtroom. The years where paperwork went quiet. The years the accuser had pointed to as proof of dishonesty. Then Judge Judy addressed the timeline again, but this time from a different angle. She explained that trauma doesn't follow neat schedules. That when someone returns from war changed, the impact often shows up not in clean medical charts, but in long periods of avoidance, delay, and silence. The very gaps that had been framed as suspicious suddenly made sense when viewed through that lens. "These aren't random years," Judge Judy said. "These are the years when people stop documenting because documenting hurts." The courtroom remained silent. She turned to the accuser, not aggressively but firmly. She walked them through the same timeline they had presented earlier but now with context. Each missing document lined up with a documented period of struggle. Each delay matched a moment when the widow would have been forced to expose her husband's condition in ways he had explicitly asked her not to. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The facts spoke clearly now. "This wasn't deception," she said. "This was restraint." She explained that lying is about intent. About trying to gain something through falsehood. But what she saw here was the opposite. A woman who had consistently chosen not to say more than she had to. Someone who had avoided embellishment, not embraced it. Someone who had accepted personal hardship rather than violate a promise. "This is what sacrifice looks like when it doesn't come with a uniform," Judge Judy said. The accuser stood still, eyes lowered. The confidence they had entered the courtroom with was gone. There was nothing left to argue against. The narrative they had constructed no longer held. The inconsistencies they relied on were now explained, not by excuses but by values. Judge Judy addressed the widow directly again. She acknowledged how difficult it must have been to sit through an accusation like that. To hear years of quiet choices framed as manipulation. To be questioned for protecting someone who could no longer speak for himself. Then she did something subtle but powerful. She reframed the entire case. What had been presented as a claim built on shaky details was now recognized as a life shaped by loyalty. What had been dismissed as missing information was revealed to be deliberate silence. And what had been called exaggeration was understood as the long-term cost of keeping a promise. The room felt lighter, but heavier at the same time. Lighter because the truth was finally clear. Heavier because of what that truth represented. Judge Judy paused before continuing, letting the weight of it settle. And it was in that moment, when respect replaced suspicion, that the story fully turned. If you believe stories like this matter, Stories where sacrifice is mistaken for lies. Tapping the like button is one small way to show that respect. The accuser didn't speak again. And it was clear now that whatever verdict was coming next, this case had already reached its turning point. The courtroom waited. Not the tense, restless waiting from earlier, but a stillness that felt heavy, almost reverent. The kind of quiet that settles when everyone senses that a line is about to be crossed, and nothing on the other side will be the same. Judge Judy looked down at her notes one last time. Then she looked up at the widow. Her voice was steady, measured, certain. "I find you fully credible," she said. The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. She continued without pause, making it unmistakably clear that the accusation had no standing. The claim of dishonesty was dismissed in its entirety. The compensation that had been questioned, challenged, and nearly stripped away would stand. There was no ambiguity in her ruling. No conditions. No warnings. Just clarity. But it didn't end there. Judge Judy paused again. This time longer than before. She didn't look at the accuser. She didn't address the paperwork. She focused entirely on the woman standing in front of her. Then she did something unexpected. She said the veteran's name. Not as a legal reference. Not as a record. But as a person. The sound of it changed the room. Names do that. They turn cases into lives. And when Judge Judy spoke his name aloud, it was as if he had been brought into the courtroom. Not in uniform, not in health, but in memory. She acknowledged his service. Briefly. Respectfully. No embellishment. No theatrics. Just recognition. Then she turned back to the widow. Her tone shifted, not dramatic but unmistakably human. "Ma'am," she said, "you didn't lie." The widow's breath caught. Judge Judy continued, her voice unwavering. "You protected a soldier. That was it." The sentence didn't echo. It didn't need to. It settled. The widow's composure collapsed in that instant, not out of weakness but release. Her shoulders shook as she covered her face, years of restraint breaking through all at once. She hadn't cried when she was accused. She hadn't cried when she was doubted. She cried when she was understood. In the gallery, people wiped their eyes without trying to hide it. Some stared at the floor. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to blink, afraid they might miss something important. The air felt thick as if the room itself was holding its breath. No one spoke. Not the accuser. Not the bailiff. Not even Judge Judy. Silence took over, not the uncomfortable silence of uncertainty, but the kind that follows truth when there's nothing left to argue. The widow struggled to steady herself. When she finally looked up again, her eyes were red, but there was something else there now: relief. Vindication. The quiet peace of someone who had carried a burden alone and had finally been seen. Judge Judy waited until the moment passed. She didn't rush it. She allowed the emotion to exist without interruption, without explanation. Because sometimes justice doesn't need commentary. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, but no less firm. "This court recognizes the sacrifice made," she said. "Not just in service, but in silence." The widow nodded, unable to speak. The accuser remained still, their earlier confidence nowhere to be found. There was nothing left to say. No counterargument. No appeal. The truth had already spoken louder than anything else could. And in that moment, it became clear that this verdict wasn't just about compensation or credibility. It was about dignity. About honoring a promise kept at great personal cost. About recognizing that some sacrifices don't come with medals or parades, but are no less real. The courtroom stayed quiet even as the case concluded. No applause. No reaction. Just tears. And that silence, heavy, respectful, final, was the sound of justice being fully understood. The case ended quietly. There was no argument. No rebuttal. No last attempt to defend what had already fallen apart. The accuser gathered their papers, eyes down, movements slow and restrained. They didn't look toward the widow. They didn't look toward the bench. They simply turned and walked out of the courtroom, the confidence they had arrived with replaced by something closer to understanding, or regret. Whatever they felt, it no longer mattered. The truth had already taken its place. The widow remained standing for a moment, as if unsure whether it was really over. Her hands still trembled slightly, but the tension that had held her rigid since the beginning of the hearing was gone. What remained was exhaustion, and relief. A bailiff gently indicated where she could sit. She did, carefully, as though the weight she had been carrying for years had finally been set down and she wasn't sure how to stand without it. Judge Judy watched her quietly. Then, before moving on, Judge Judy offered a final reflection. Not a lecture. Not a warning. Just a statement, measured, sincere, and unmistakably personal. Justice isn't always about rules, she said. Sometimes it's about remembering sacrifice. The words didn't need explanation. Everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant. The widow nodded. She didn't smile. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was acknowledgement. It was dignity restored. It was the quiet reassurance that the promise she had kept, often at her own expense, had been seen and honored. As the courtroom prepared to move on to the next case, the atmosphere remained subdued. People shifted in their seats slowly, as if reluctant to disturb what had just happened. Some wiped their eyes. Others stared ahead, lost in thought. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a reminder, one that lingered long after the verdict had been delivered. The widow gathered her belongings. As she stood to leave, she paused for a brief moment, turning back toward the bench. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The acknowledgement had already been given. And as she walked out of the courtroom, she wasn't alone anymore, not in the way she had been when she entered. Stories like this matter. Not because they make good television, but because they reveal the quiet costs of service that never make headlines. The spouses who protect dignity. The families who absorb pain in silence. The promises kept long after the uniform is folded away. If you believe America should never forget the families who carry the cost of service, subscribe to the channel, because this isn't the last story that deserves to be heard. This case may be over, but it isn't the end. In the next story, another military family will walk into a courtroom carrying a burden no paperwork can fully explain. Another accusation will be made, one that seems convincing on the surface, but hides a deeper truth underneath. And once again, a verdict will remind everyone watching that justice isn't just about what's written down. It's about what people live with. Until then, remember this case. Remember the widow who chose dignity over defense. Remember the soldier whose name was spoken with respect. And remember that sometimes, the most powerful truths are the ones that take the longest to say. Because when they finally are said, they don't just end cases. They stay with us.